Hello everyone, this is WCVV5 fan here, and it's time now for another, for a different video. I'm going to talk, a video that I'm going to talk about. It's going to be something different. So, this time I'm going to talk about the Sesame Street episodes I remember seeing on television. This does not include episodes that I first saw on the internet. So, I'm only going to talk about the list that I first saw on PBS Kids. So, yeah, now the reason why I put season 34 to 37 is because this is the majority of this is pretty much all the episodes I'm ever seeing, if not most of them, from these seasons. It's where, in this season, it would show, I'm just going to talk about, how the theme was for these seasons. So, the theme song went, well, we obviously know what the title is, but it would show, the block theme, and, with Big Bird, with some kids at Central Park at a playground. I think that's where it was, because Sesame Street was filmed in New York City. And coincidentally, I actually grew up near New York City, and I know that the Beast also grew up near there as well. So yeah, I also remember the PBS fundings as well for this era, and where Gordon, who was played by Roscoe Orman, would say what Sesame Street was like brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you. Thank you. That's what he would say. So yeah. So I actually loved the theme song, and then the ending. Now this is actually the first 4 seasons where where the credits would be shown at the end of every episode. Prior to this, they would only be shown mostly during episodes that aired on Fridays. Sometimes they would be shown though during the season premiere. So yeah. So with that being said, let's get started. So this is the era where they would have the blocks being shown. I'll just demonstrate what scenes were shown during the blocks. I'm not going to talk about the ones from season 30 that were exclusive to season 33 because it doesn't make sense. Because for this video it's going to be about the episodes I remember seeing from seasons 34 to 37. So the blocks that were shown, the first 2 were shown that would show a clip from Elmo's World, the episode Flowers, Plants, and Trees, as well as a Monster Clubhouse scene, the part where Narf comes down the pole. It's kind of like sliding down a fireman pole. Narf, by the way, is the orange monster. We'll actually talk about Narf a little bit further on as we get down this list. And then it's during the part where the kids would sing "Where the Air Is Sweet," and then after they would sing the first time they would sing after they sing how can you tell me how to get to Sesame Street, the first time it would then show another pair of scenes. It would show a clip from the Letter of the Day with the Letter of the Day L segment from Cookie Monster where he was eating that cookie, and then the Count's Number of the Day segment, which in that one it was 5. I'm not talking about that was not the number of the day in the theme. It was just that was just the clip from the Number of the Day 5 segment of the pipe organ. And then as Big Bird bumps his head on, I believe it was like a pair of steps on the playground on top of that, it would then show a clip from Journey to Ernie, the Musicland segment, and then a Global Grover segment, and then Ernie and Bert's segment, an older one. And then then Big Bird would point to the sky and say and show Super Grover up in the sky, and then he would fall and crash into the Sesame Street sign, and then show the episode number as he was recovering from his fall. So yeah. So without further ado, let's begin the list, shall we? All right. Let's start with episode 4031. This is actually the season premiere of season 34. The only thing I might remember about this scene is the Cats segment that was shown after the Number of the Day in this episode, which was 7, and I might remember the 7 kids, the scene where 7 kids were dancing on a playground at the same time to the same beat. And I'm using my iPad to help remind me of what parts of the segments I remember seeing, so that I can discuss them here. So the Ernie and Bert scenes. I also remember the Ernie and Bert segments. Segment possibly where Bert was interrupted by Ernie with a room of with some monsters dancing, and of course he was forced to dance a tango. And then I might remember the Global Grover segment where he talks about Africa with an elephant nearby. I guess it makes sense because elephants are from Africa. And then I also might remember the letter of the day of this episode, for those that are wondering, was N. And I might remember the Spanish word of the day in this episode, which was gracias, which, for those that are wondering, is Spanish for thank you. And maybe the Elmo's World segment, which was mail. This was actually a new installment in this episode, so yeah. All right, now on to 4032. The only thing I remember in this episode was the Barnyard Journey to Ernie segment and the scene where the first lady at the time, which was Laura Bush, reads a book to Elmo, Big Bird, and some kids called Wubba Wubba Woo. And maybe the and I also remember the Journey, not Journey to Ernie, second, like the animated clip where the late Jerry Nelson, may rest in peace, sings "In My Book," and maybe the Por Favor Spanish word of the day, which is Spanish for please, and the Elmo's World Ears segment that's in this episode as well. This was also a new one too, so yeah. 4033. This episode I definitely remember seeing, because I do remember seeing an episode where the number of the day was with these two things. The number of the day being 19, and an Elmo's World segment from season 30, which happens in this episode where it had the food segment. And now let me explain something here. The part that scared me during Elmo's World season 30 is, first of all, most of the episodes from season 31 onwards, when Elmo starts singing la 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 Elmo's World, that stuff, it would zoom into a drawing of Elmo inside his world. But in season 30 episodes, that did not happen. Instead, it sings la 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 Elmo's World before the camera zooms into the drawing of Elmo. And then obviously the background was much, much different compared to how it was in season 31 onwards. And I also didn't like the way Elmo said hello to the camera and to Dorothy, because he was very loud. That also happened in the drawing episode too, but it was different in that. So yeah, because I think the way he said hello to the viewers in those in all season 30 Elmo's World episodes, as well as the drawing episode, was kind of loud. So yeah, yes, I understand he was excited, but I think he could have just been a little bit more calmer, and that would have been fine with me. I would have been okay with that. Okay, here's episode 4034. The only thing I might remember this episode is the Tokyo String Quartet, where the Count Von Count remembers where Count counts the string musicians, and the number of the day, by the way, in this episode was 4, and the letter of the day in this episode was M. And I also might remember the Ernie and Bert segment where Bert describes a circle, and maybe the letter, and I might remember the typefaces animation of the letter M. And I also think I might remember the Spanish word of the day, which was leche. And of course the Elmo's World Birthdays episode, which makes sense to have that in this episode, because the main segment was about Bert celebrating his birthday. 4035. Now, spoiler alert: this season, as well as seasons 35 and 36, I've seen a whole lot of them. And before I get back to that, I just want to tell you the reason why is because Sesame Street aired on WNET, which was one of my local PBS stations, at 7 a.m. in the morning, right? And that gave me enough time. And I didn't start school during those seasons until I believe 8:30 or 9. I think it was like around that time. It was pretty late for a school start. So yeah, and then so back to episode 4035. I might remember the episode. I definitely remember seeing an episode where a girl types the number 11, which was the number of the day in this episode, on a computer. And I also remember seeing an episode seeing the jungle segment on Journey to Ernie, and the scene where Ernie shows where a boy named Richie shows Ernie how to type his name Richie's name on the computer. So yeah, and I also remember the computers episode from Elmo's World being shown here too. 4036. This episode I definitely remember seeing. I definitely remember the letter of the day in this episode, which was I, and the main reason, and I know this because I do remember seeing the segment where Elmo, Telly, Zoe, and Rosita sing appear at a beach with pop singer Sheryl Crow, and they sing a parody of the song "Soak Up the Sun" and I know this because that was actually my favorite song in the early 2000s. That was one of my favorite songs in the early 2000s, by the way. Whenever that song came on the radio, my mom was like, "Your song's on." Same with another song called "Drift Away" by Uncle Kracker and Dobie Gray. So yeah. And I also remember the Spanish word of the day in this episode, which was "hola," which is Spanish for hello, of course. And I might also remember the segment, the street story in this episode, which was about Gordon showing Elmo how to play chess, and Gordon also practicing his moves so that he could try to beat Alan, who, as he said, was a champ in that episode. And I remember in playing chess. I remember seeing this episode quite a few times as a kid. So yeah. 4037. The only thing that I remember about this episode is maybe the Wegmans dog segment where they sit on each on one where a dog sits on an end of a seesaw, and other things get added on the other end. And I might also remember the ordinate number 8, which was the number of the day of this episode. Oh, I forgot to talk about what the number of the day was in 4036. It was 10, for those that are wondering. In fact, we're going to talk about another episode later on this list that I do remember seeing that also had that number as the number of the day as well. And I think I might have forgotten to talk about what the number of the day was in the letter of the day was in 4035. And the letter of that one was U. And we'll also be talking about another episode later on that I do remember seeing about the letter where that was the letter of the day. So yeah. I remember seeing episode 4037 I might remember seeing this episode. It's about I might remember like I said, I might remember the Ornate 8 strolling through a gate segment, and then I might also, and then I definitely remember seeing the Journey to Ernie's Shape segment. Maybe I saw this episode, maybe I did not, but I also remember the cartoon segment where the junkyard spells the word fun. And I also remember the Spanish word of the day, which was flor, which was kind of weird. That was a weird one. So yeah. 4038. I do remember the scene where Garth Brooks, Harry Monster, and a band of cowboy hat, where other monsters wearing cowboy hats sing "Together We Make Music." Garth Brooks, by the way, is a country singer, for those that are wondering. And I also might remember the Global Grover segment from Alaska. And I think maybe I've seen the Elmo's World segment in this episode, which was Wild Animals. So yeah. Maybe I also remember the Spanish word of the day segment, which was Libro. 4039. I do remember the street story in this segment where Maria, Gabby. Let me share a fun fact about Gabby before I get back to it, since we're talking about her here. The actress who played Gabby, Desiree Casado, actually grew up in Cortlandt Manor, New York, and I'm only bringing this up because I actually had step family members that lived in that town in New York. So yeah, I actually found this on a source on the internet. So yeah, so that's how I know. Anyway, so yeah. I mean, I would not have said that if I found this out privately. So yeah, but I found out publicly. Anyway, I do. So back to this episode, I do remember the scene. Like I said, I remember the scene where they where Maria, Gabby, Susan, and Bob, who was actually born the same year. May Bob rest in peace. He was actually born the same year as my grandmother on my dad's side. For those fun fact, and they count down from, I believe, 10 to 0 on a rocket, and they say goodbye to the rocket that's going up to space. I also remember the Milo counting segment, and the number of the day was 9. And I also remember the scene where Ernie and Aaron Neville sing, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, singing "I Don't Want to Live on the Moon." And maybe the letter of the day of the segment, which was B. So yeah. Okay, episode 4040. So I remember the scene where Robert De Niro teaches Elmo about an actor. I also remember the number of day in this episode, which was 0. And the letter of the day in this episode was T. And I also remember the Spanish word of the day segment, which was Niño and Niña, boy and girl. So yeah. All right, 4042. I put a question mark here because let me get to that for a second. Just one moment, guys. I might remember the scene where the letter of the day in this episode being the letter K, because I do kind of remember seeing that, and I'm pretty sure it was this episode, and I think I also remember the segment where Ernie sings "Rubber Ducky," from the season 30 version. So yeah, and maybe the Almost World segment, which was in this episode, was Fishes. 4044. Let me see about this one. I might remember. Let me see. 4044. I might remember the letter of the day segment, which let me see what I remember this episode. I'm trying to remember. I remember the segment where oh yeah, I remember. It was the scene where Bip Bidata, who is played by Jim Henson, sings a song about air. And it makes sense to have that because the main segment was about Elmo and Zoe flying kites. So yeah. 4045. I put a question mark here because I might remember the scene where the Wegman dogs appeared when they make wood blocks, and they shape the wood blocks to make the number of the day in this episode, which was 1, and the letter of the day was C, for those that are wondering. And I think I might remember the letter of the day segment of this episode too, and maybe the Hero Guy segment where Hero Guy grows very big, and then he shrinks as well. 4046. Now this episode I do remember seeing. I do remember the main scene where the cast sings. I'm sorry, where Alan, Bob, Gabby, Miles, Elmo, and the sheep and Rosita as well sing "Something in the Air," and I remember that segment very well. So yeah, and I also remember the cartoon segment where the number 2 train appears. Yes, 2 was the number of the day in this episode. And the letter of the day was O. I honestly think the Elmo's World singing episode should have been in this episode instead of the music segment, because first of all, the music segment was shown in another season 34 episode, which we'll get to in a little bit. And yes, music does kind of make sense, but I think the singing episode from Elmo's World should have been in this one, because that would have made more sense, because the main segment was about singing. It's where Elmo and Rosita plan to have a play date together, and but they can't find each other, and they try to look for each other. Eventually they do, obviously, so yeah. 4048, let's see about this one. I think I've seen this one, because I do remember the Bible counting segment, which to the number 7. Yes, 7 was number in this episode as well. Maybe I might, and I also, and I also remember the scene where Ernie sings a song about when Bert's not here, his apartment, that is. So yeah, and it happens in here, in this episode. 4049. Let's see this one. I put a question mark here because I might remember the number in this episode, which was 18. I also might remember, and I think I might remember seeing. I do remember seeing the segment where Ernie sings "Imagine That," where he imagines a knight fighting a dragon, a sailor, and then obviously Ernie himself. And I might remember the letter of the day in this episode, which is R, where the Run segment was used. The cartoon about the R makes the word run. And, yeah. And maybe the Elmo's World segment here, which was books. 4050, I do remember seeing an episode where Zoe talks about her tutu, which she would use quite a lot in season 31 through, I believe, season 48, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong, though. Or no, season 32, maybe season 32 through 48. Sorry about that. And I also remember the segment where, I also remember the cartoon segment where they used some lemons to make lemonade. The number of the day in this episode was 3, and the letter of the day, the letter of the day in this episode was A. And I also remember the Apple cartoon as well. 4052. Now, this episode I've seen quite a few times. I do remember the street story where a character try to get there. Yeah, a character named Scotty McKill, who's played by Jerry Nelson, teaches us, shows us bagpipes, which is an instrument made in Scotland, a musical instrument made in Scotland. I definitely remember the Monster Clubhouse segment, which was about the triangle, the furry shape of the day. The number of the day of this episode, which was 10. And I definitely remember this because I do remember seeing this. This is the episode I remember seeing where at the end of after they sing when they finish singing the Monster Goodbye song in Monster Clubhouse, Narf the orange monster shoves his mouth into the camera, which I was terrified of that. I was like, Narf, don't eat me. I know Jordan Knight's fanboy was scared of that segment, as well. So yeah, and yes, while we're at it, I was also scared of the scene in Elmo's World Farms, where Elmo shoves his mouth into the camera, and he also did mouths, but in that one it actually makes sense, because in that episode he used that as a reference to what Elmo was referring to. So yeah, and but Farms, it just didn't make any sense. It was so unsettling. So yeah, and then back to episode 4052. I also remember the scene where the cartoon where the room was full of chickens. The Ernie segment where Ernie as a farmer sings plants growing high and growing low. The letter of the day in this episode, which was V, and the Spanish word of the day, which is flor. And I also remember the closing segment where the number 1 appears first, and then the number 0. And Big Bird says number 1 isn't the number of the day, and then when Scotty blows out the 0 in his bagpipe, well, he did the same thing with number 1 as well. And so the closing segment, I do remember the scene where Scotty blows out the number 1, and then he blows out the number 0. So yeah. 4053. I do remember seeing an episode where a nighttime closing was used, and with the number of the day being 16, which happened in this episode. So yeah. And the letter of the day in this episode, for those that are wondering, was P. 4054. I think I've seen this one because I do remember seeing the Hornet 17s swinging by with, yes, 17 was the number of the day, for those that are wondering. The letter of the day in this episode was X. And we'll talk about another episode with those two sponsors when we, a little bit later on. And I also might remember the Elmo's World segment, which is dancing. 4055. This episode I do remember seeing. I do remember the segment where I do remember seeing an episode. The only thing I remember about this episode was the water segment, the Almost World water segment, which was used. This was actually the last episode before season 40 came out, which that actually had this Almost World episode in it. So yeah. And 4056. 1 second. I might remember the scene where Ernie sees a drawing of Devin's family, and the letter of the day in this episode, which was Z, and the number of the day, which fittingly was 4, because it's about the 4 bears. Okay, now on to C35, starting with episode 4057, which is called The Street We Live On. And this episode I definitely remember seeing. I definitely remember the scene where a few things. And with this episode mainly takes place in Elmo's World. I definitely remember the C is for Cookies song with the version with opera singer Marilyn Horne. And I also remember the Traction Jackson segment where he sings Me in My Chair. I also remember the scene where the Count shows up in Elmo's World, announcing that when Elmo counts the total of monsters, he would find the number of the day, which was 10. And I also remember the weird Journey to Ernie intro where Big Bird appears behind shade, and wondering where Ernie was, which obviously he was not. And the Journey to Ernie segment of this episode was Nursery Rhyme Land. And I also remember I might remember the scene where Bert appears behind the door in Elmo's World, so yeah. And this episode was actually dedicated to Michael Jeter, who actually played Mr. Noodle's brother Mr. Noodle. Sadly, he died in 2003. I think he died of a seizure or something. I'll put in the description if I'm wrong. But but if I'm correct, then I can relate to that, because on October 10th, 2018, I actually lost a former roommate of mine of a seizure. I won't get into more details about that because that's off topic. But anyway, I put a question mark here on 4058 because I might remember the segment where the scene where Baby Bear, Elmo, Zoe, and Telly argue about who's the best pet, and maybe the number of the day in this episode, which was 8. The letter of the day in this episode was B. And this was actually the first episode to feature a Trash Gordon closing. For those that are wondering, Trash Gordon was Roscoe Orman playing as Trash Gordon, where Oscar would read a book to Slimy every night, to close out the episode. So yeah. Okay, 4060. This one. Let me talk about, what could I say about this one? I remember the letter of the day of this episode, which was D, and because I do remember the part where Cookie Monster writes the sign that says "don't," so he doesn't eat the cookie, but then he eats the part where the end of the apostrophe and the T appears, so he eats that part that the sign says "do," and then he eats the cookie. And I also remember the song where it's an ode to Dad, and it says "Dad, D-A-D, Dad," like that. Yeah, I remember that. I also remember the Ernie and Bert segment where Ernie tells Bert to guess what Ernie pretends to be, which was a stove. And I also remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 17. Okay, 4061. I do remember this. I might remember the scene where the street story where where Baby Bear and Zoe, where Cinderella appears, and oddly enough, I didn't know that Cinderella's godmother was Andrea Martin, who voiced the lecture lady in the Elmo's World cartoon segments, which I thought that was pretty cool, actually. I also remember the Journey to Ernie segment, and I do remember seeing the scene where Ernie sings "OK Cole" in the intro, and I also remember the number in this episode, which was 5. The letter name in this episode was E, by the way, and I do remember a scene where seeing 2 girls counting to 5 as they clap along, and a cartoon where it shows 5 outlines of people dancing. 4062. I remember the scene. I think I remember seeing the where Angel Corella dances with the alphabet, and Telly, Zoe, and Elmo name the letters as they appear. And I also remember seeing the Journey to Ernie segment where Big Bird actually plays a game, one of these things within the game Journey to Ernie. And I also remember this weird part of the number of the day, which was 6, where instead of the count, well, he does play the pipe organ at the beginning, but instead of it revealing the number of the day, he goes to watch television and he shows the spoof of 6 Feet Under, which was a sitcom a few decades ago. And I also remember the scene where the count off screen sings a song about 6 children at the beach. And the letter day in this episode, like, if I haven't said so, is F. 4063. I do remember, the only thing I remember about this episode was the number of the day, which was 20. And I know this because I've seen, I do remember seeing the animation where a kid counts 20 bears in 20 chairs. And I might also remember the Joe 100 Guy segment where he was supposed to count 100 by 10s, but does not know how. And actually his real name was George Birnbaum. And the letter name of this episode, for those that are wondering, was T. 4064. I kind of remember, I might remember the scene where Zoe does a dance that her pet Rocco made up, which of course we all know Elmo gets annoyed when Zoe brings up about Rocco. We'll talk about another episode where that with Rocco later in the season. Fun fact. I also remember the scene where the Journey to Ernie segment, which was the rhyme, which is a playground about words that rhyme. And I think I might have seen. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I think I've seen this episode. That's now I can officially say, because I do remember the number of the day in this episode, which is 1. The letter day was A, and the wood blocks to make number 1, and the Elmo's World dancing segment was in this episode too. So yeah. 4065. I remember this episode because I do remember seeing the scene where Ernie sings about him sitting alone under an apple tree, and it happens in this episode. And I also remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 7, and the letter of the day was I. So yeah. 4066. I remember I might remember the Animal Book song, which was sung by Kevin Clash, who played Elmo. I also remember the Jumping Jay segment, and maybe the Reuben Studdard scene where he and Elmo sing the alphabet song. The Journey to Ernie segment where Big Bird searches for Ernie in a landfill of rubber duckies. Actually, wait a second. I forgot to put one more episode in there. because I actually can confirm. I'm actually going to remember this question mark here from episode 4042, because I can officially say I did see this episode, because I do remember seeing that episode in 2003. So yeah. So anyway, so back to this one. Back to the segment, because I also remember seeing the Ernie the scene where Ernie sings "Duty Rubber Duck," which is a reggae song, and I also, because I remember the Count Von Count singing in this his verse in this song as well. And I also remember the Elmo's World Book segment, too. And the number of the day, while we're at it, was 9. And the letter of the day was, like I said earlier, was J. 4067. The thing I do remember seeing the letter of the day in this episode, which was K. And I do remember, I forgot to mention, going back to episode 4061 real quick. I do remember, I found it kind of weird, like what is Prairie Dawn doing in here? I remember she would appear with Cookie Monster in some of the letter of the day segments in this season, and she tries to tell Cookie not to eat the letter of the day, and he doesn't listen, of course. Although there was one segment, I think it was the letter of the day was H in that one, where Prairie Dawn eats it instead. So yeah, I also remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 4. The letter of the day was, like I said earlier, was K. Because I do remember the Count Von Count segment where he counts 4 bats instead of playing his organ. I put a question mark for 4068 because I do kind of remember the letter of the day in this episode, which was L. And what else? I also remember the Ernie segment where Ernie sings "I Love My Room." And I also remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 11, and the Elmo's World Hand segment as well. Because I do remember, like I said, I do remember the girl typing the number 11 on a computer, like I said earlier, and I'm pretty sure this episode I definitely remember seeing it happening. 4069. Now, this episode I do remember seeing quite a few times on PBS. I do remember the scene where Snuffy plays a magical ukulele and then disappears, and then the ukulele breaks down. I also remember the letter of the day in this episode, which is M. And I remember the scene where Maya Angelou appears with Elmo. I also remember the Apple segment, the cartoon, the Journey to Ernie segment, which was the Beanstalk, the Ernie scene where he sings "Somebody Come and Play" with Rubber Ducky, the number of the day in this episode being 12, because I do remember the Milo counting to 12, and the counting stars by 3s. And I also remember the scene where Gabby and Rosita sing "Tu me gustas," which is Spanish for "I like you." I also remember the Elmo's World segment, which was Sky, because I do remember seeing the scene where Slimy flies an airplane. And then I also remember the Trash Gordon closing as well, because the way Slimy said trash in this episode in the beginning kind of scared me a little bit. And then after the Trash Gordon scene was closed, as Oscar tells Slimy to go to bed, instead of it playing the 1969 harmonica song, most episodes in season 35, 37, it would have the harmonica closing from 1969, but this episode had the 1995 nighttime closing, which I thought was kind of odd for me. But then again, it made sense because because this is actually the only Sesame Street episode that actually had a Trash Gordon that Trash Gordon scene that was not the last segment of the episode. Because after that, it would show Big Bird and the Invisible Snuffy at Big Bird's nest. Looking forward to the next episode, which I'll get to that in a moment, where the ukulele was fixed. So now let's get to that one. 4070. I do remember seeing this Elmo riding on the back of the Invisible Snuffy, and of course Snuffy appearing again. So yeah. I also remember the letter day was being O. Ernie showing Bird about air with the fan blowing and blowing his book away. Some crayons playing together in a cartoon segment, and the number of the day, which was 14. 4071. I might remember the scene where Grover teaches Zoe and Rosita and some kids about superheroes. I might remember the letter of the day in this episode, which was H, which makes sense because H stands for help. I might also remember the Journey to Ernie segment, which was about chili, icy, and Snowyville, and I also might remember seeing the episode where Ernie and Rubber Ducky recite the alphabet with Christopher Reeve, who sadly passed away in 2004, the year this episode came out. May he rest in peace. And I also remember the number of the day of this episode, which was 13, where the girl finds a 13 on a computer screen, and the Elmo's World segment, which was firefighters. So yeah. Now on to episode 4073. I might remember. Actually, wait a minute. I'm actually going to put 4072 on this one too, because I do remember the letter. I do remember the letter of the day sketch in this episode, which the letter of the day was P. And I remember Prairie Dawn reminding Cookie Monster that her name starts with the letter P. So yeah, the number in that one was 15, for those that are wondering. Now on, so back to episode 4073. I do remember seeing I think this was the episode I remember seeing with the Ernie and Aaron singing "I Don't Want to Live in the Moon," and so yeah, I think I might have seen this episode, and I do remember seeing the cartoon where David Rumman tries to make way for a queen and a duck gets in his way. Now on to 4074. I do remember the reason why I remember seeing this episode, because I do remember the number day being 18 in this episode, and I remember the letter day being R. The Spanish word day was feliz, which is Spanish for happy. The Happy Happiness song playing where what's that guy's name? Tyrone Davis sings about kids playing at a beach. The Journey to Ernie segment, which was Journey to Big Bird, where Ernie where Ernie seeks for Big Bird in the circus. I also remember the Global Grover segment where he goes to Hawaii. Like I said, the number day was 18, and the Elmo's World segment being male. I put a question mark for 4075 because I might remember the segment where Cookie Monster who in this street story was actually played by Frank Oz. It was actually the last street story to have him being played by Frank Oz. And I also remember the celebrity scene where Ray Charles, who sadly died in 2004, sings with other celebrities, including Michael Jeter, who, like I said, passed away in 2003, Patrick Stewart, Tony Bennett, who died last year, Sherry Lewis, who died in 1998, what other celebrities? Harry Belafonte, who died last year. What else? David Robinson, who was an NBA player for the San Antonio Spurs, and Ellen DeGeneres. And I also remember the letter of the day was S, and the number of the day in this episode was 19. And I also remember the Ernie Bert segment, which was where Bert sings to Ernie the "In My Book" song that I talked about earlier. And I also remember the handprints as well, the handprints segment, and the Elmo's World being computers. 4076. This episode I definitely remember seeing a few times as a kid. I do remember the letter of the day, which was G, and I was terrified of that giant cookie landing, falling from the ceiling, I guess. I also remember the pencil box segment of showing the letter G. I remember the Spanish word of the day, which was gato, which is Spanish for cat. I also remember the scene where Ernie sings the honker ducky dinger jamboree. I definitely remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 20, and I know this because whenever the number of the day was 20, I would be thrilled because I'm a numbers guy, and of course it's because of my type 1 diabetes. And I also remember the Trash Gordon closing as well, where Gordon pretends to be a kitty cat to scare away a giant guppy. 4077. I also remember seeing this episode quite a few times. I do remember this segment where Zoe swings on the tires, where Gabby pushes Zoe on the tire swing, and it's a scene where, and yes, this is the episode of another episode I remember seeing with Rocco in it, and of course Elmo was terrified by it, and it's also another scene where Gabby helps Alan, who's away in Hawaii on vacation. I also remember the letter of the day in this episode, which was you, and I also remember the cartoon where you knocks on the door of the letter P's apartment, and they make and they go up together. I also remember the Ernie Bert segment where Ernie makes a snowman, and I also remember the number of the day, which was 3, And oh, one more thing I also remember this episode I forgot to talk about. It's the scene where Dr. Phil and Dr. Phil, who was a parody of Dr. Phil himself, argue over whose show should be on, but they decided to do a crossover of both shows. So yeah. 4078. I also remember this episode. I do remember the scene where Baby Bear tries to help his sister Curly go to sleep. And I also, because I remember Oscar and his elephant appearing as well. And that elephant truck also scared me as a kid, too. So, yeah. I also remember the number day, which is 8, because I do remember the scene where 8 apples grow on a tree. And I also remember the 8 children dancing in a color block grid, and the Elmo's World segment, which was sleep. And the letter day of this episode was V, for those that are wondering. 4079. I also remember, I do remember seeing this episode because I do remember seeing an Elmo's World Music segment where the Elmo's World Music episode before Trash Gordon closing, which happened in this episode. I honestly thought it happened in episode 4066, which happened in the online version, but nope, it had the book segment in that episode. So yeah, I forgot to talk about that, I think. Yeah, I did. Anyway. Although I do kind of remember seeing Elmo's World book segment before Trash Gordon closing. But anyway, back to 4079. I do remember the letter of the day in this episode, kind of, which was W, and the number of the day was 5. And yeah, I do remember that. Yeah, I do remember the number of the day being 5 because I do remember the song where a toucan leads number of children and frogs and fruit as they go down a road. I might remember the Triangle Bob Triangle Pants segment, and yeah, so this video's, yeah, I kind of expect this video is going to be kind of long because this is a long list of episodes. 4081. I kind of remember the scene where Nora Jones sings spoofs her song "Don't Know Why" with the letter Y with Elmo. I also remember the scene where Ernie and Elmo Sing After Me, and the number of the day was 7. And I also remember the Elmo's World Weather segment as well. I might also remember the scene where Rosita feels like she's being treated differently because of her culture, which she's from Mexico, and but Sesame Street, but especially Gabby, taught her that she's very important to the community there, which is really nice. I thought that was pretty nice. Lastly, episode 4082 in this season. I do remember the segment where the wolf gets upset when he loses a game. I also remember the letter day, which was Z. How fitting. And because I do remember the segment where Cookie Monster gets some cookies for once with Prairie Dawn. And the number day being 11 as well. So, yeah. Okay, so now on to season 36. 4083. I do remember seeing an episode where I actually was kind of shocked when I saw Joe Torre, who was then the manager of the New York Yankees, which is, fun fact, that's my favorite baseball team. And I also remember seeing the cartoon segment about the apple, and the number day, which was 4, because that was actually the first time I remember seeing instead of the pipe organ being shown, it would show a Jack in the Box segment with the number day was 1 through 10, and the numbers 11 through 20, we'll get to that later, but yeah. Next up is all right, now on to episode 4084. Let me see here. I put a question mark here because I might remember the letter of the day being J, the number of the day being 9, and maybe the banana segment from Elmo's World before Trash Gordon closing. I don't know, though. Anyway, 4085. I kind of remember the scene where Elmo and Zoe play a game about fruits and vegetables. And what else? I do remember the letter of the day, which was G. The number of the day was 6. And maybe, I might remember seeing the flowers doubling up from 3 and 6. So, yeah. 4086. Let's see. This one, I might remember the scene where Alan Big Bird make birdseed cookies for Big Bird's grandmother. And I also remember the scene where Ernie and Elmo singing Cher, but then again, they also did that in episode 4033, which I also remember seeing. But I also remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 8, because I do remember the Milo counting to 8 scene, because I do remember 8 appeared in a different background in that film as well. The letter day in this episode, for those that are wondering, was Q. So, yeah. 4087, I put a question mark in this one as well, because I kind of remember the letter day, which was E. I do remember the Spanish word day, which was escuela, which is Spanish for school. And maybe the scene where Papa Bear talks to Antonio, a kid named Antonio, about his teeth, about how he takes care of them. And maybe the exercise segment from Elmo's World. 4088. I do remember this episode where, because I might remember the scene where they had to count how many balloons it would take to raise Snuffy up in the air. It was 40, which was 40 balloons, for those that are wondering. I also remember the letter day, which was K. And I definitely remember seeing the Imagine That segment where Ernie sings that song, and the number of the day in this episode, which was 12. And yeah, because I do, and this, and by the way, I do remember this. If the number of the day was 11 through 20 in this season, it would the Count Von Count would appear with his girlfriend Countess Daling Von Daling, I think is what her name is. And if the number of the day was 11 through 19, she would shout stop, which scared the heck out of me. So yeah. 4089. I remember. I do remember this episode pretty well. I remember the scene where the Joe Raposo, the film where the late Joe Raposo sings "Everybody Eats," the number of the day being 4, the singing episode from Elmo's World, and the letter of the day being O. So yeah. So now on to episode 4090, which I do remember seeing very well. I remember the scene where Cookie Monster tries to draw the moon because he thinks it's made out of a cookie, and I remember the scene where Cookie Monster thinks he could climb a ladder to reach the moon, which obviously didn't, which would not be a success. And maybe the scene where Buzz Aldrin teaches Cookie and the kids there about the moon itself. So yeah, anyway, and I also remember the letter of the day being T and the number of the day being 2. So yeah. 4092. What can I say about this one? I actually might remember seeing this episode because 4091, excuse me. I might remember seeing this episode because I do remember seeing a few season 36 and 30, at least one season 36 and 37 episode where the number of the day was 0 because the pipe organ segment was still used here. So I'll just put here with a question mark. I might also remember the Trash Gordon closing as well, where he just lands on the planet nothing. So yeah, 4092. I do remember the scene where they talk about where Elmo, Zoe, and Grover sing a song about walking with a new way to walk with the group Destiny's Child. I remember the letter day being U. And And I also might remember the number of the day being 8. 4093. This one I do remember seeing. I do remember seeing the segment where Baby Bear goes to school and the school bell rings as well. And the Elmo's World being segment about school as well. I also remember the Journey to Ernie segment about Transportation Land. This season, Journey to Ernie wouldn't appear as much, and they would drop and it would be cut entirely from season 37 onwards. So yeah, I also remember the number of the day being 1, because I do remember the scene where they show 4 strawberries as well, and they subtract it down to 1. So yeah, 4094. I do remember. I might remember seeing this episode where had the Garth Brooks, Harry Monster, and the other monsters singing Together We'll Make Music. The only thing I think I remember about this episode was the number of the day being 19. So yeah, the letter of the day was in this episode was S. 4095. I might remember, the only thing I remember this episode was the Elmo's World was the animation of the letter Z and various typefaces. Maybe the Journey to Ernie segment about Ernie behind a dinosaur, and the Elmo's World segment, which was cats. So yeah. 4096. I do remember this episode because I do remember the Elmo's World segment, which was about skin. And I might remember the Journey to Ernie segment about a Big Bird searching for Ernie in a letter B museum. And I honestly thought that Big Bird would hide in a bucket, which would fit because obviously bucket starts with letter B. But no, he was actually hiding behind Big Bird himself, which I thought that was pretty odd. 4097. Now this episode I do remember seeing. Yeah, I definitely remember seeing this episode at a hospital, at a local hospital when I lived in Connecticut at the time, because I do remember the number of the day in this episode, which was 18. Because I do remember seeing the scene where the Count sinks up to 18 until the Countess stops him. I might remember the abstract segment and the kid mural painting to 18. And this segment was actually about rocks, by the way. This episode was about rocks. The letter day in this episode, for those who are wondering, was H. So it turns out I did see, and this was actually the episode where Prairie Dawn mimics what Cookie Monster would do, and she eats the H herself. And so it turns out, I honestly thought I didn't see that segment, but it turns out I did. So yeah. Now next up is 4098. I do remember the scene where the letter day being the letter Y. And I also forgot to mention, I do also remember seeing a segment where the His Y and Her Y song was sung. I'll put in the description what episode I've seen it in, if I can figure it out. 4099. I remember the scene where Elmo and Gordon do an experiment. And Zoe as well. And Telly too. They do an experiment on things that float and things that sink in water, and things that float above water, I should say. Now to 4100. Now we get to the 4100s. Now I might remember the scene where let me see here. Hang on, I gotta look at something else here. Oh yeah, I do remember the number of day in this episode, which was 10, because it counted because they used the Jack in the Box and cranked it all the way up to 10. Because I was waiting, because I was hoping to see it, and it turns out and there you go. 4101. I remember this episode. I do remember seeing. I do remember the scene where Elmo and Zoe were fighting over a ball, which turns out belonged to Cinderella. And I also remember the letter day being X, and I also remember the Ernie Bert segment where Ernie encourages Bert and the viewers to rub their stomachs and pat their heads. and the number of the day in this episode, which was 17. I also remember the Elmo's World segment in this episode, which was balls, which makes sense because obviously the main segment was about a ball, the street scene, that is. 4102. I put a question mark here because I do remember seeing an episode where the number of the day was 16, which happened here, which happens in this episode with letter day being V. Maybe I remember seeing an episode where I might remember the Almost World Pets segment in this episode, which makes sense because the main segment the main scene took place at a veterinarian's office where a doctor would check pets. 4103. Okay. I might remember the day being F, and the animation where Dancing with the Flowers was used, and maybe actually I do remember seeing, because I do remember the number of this episode as well, which was 11, because I do remember when this was the episode they would show when the fundings were used with the count announcing what the number of days was going to be. So yeah. Now up to 40. Oh, actually, never mind. No, not this one. Sorry, no, I didn't see this one. Or maybe I did. I don't know, because anyway. 4107. Okay, let's go to that one. 4107. I do remember seeing this one. Is another episode where I remember the number of the day being 20, because I do remember if 20 was the number of the day, the countess would not stop the count, because obviously that's the highest sponsor on most episodes on Sesame Street, as everyone knows. And I also remember the Elmo's World Up and Down segment, and the letter day in this episode was M. And I also remember the Count Von Count segment where he watches another favorite program being 24, and much like the 6 Feet Under segment, he would play the organ at the beginning, and then he would stop and go watch television. Which I thought was kind of weird, because, like, first of all, especially this one, it's like, wait a minute, it's not time for another day yet. So yeah, like that. Yeah, I thought it was kind of weird. Anyway, and lastly, 4108. The only thing I remember this episode was the Journey to Bert segment, where Bert fills in for Ernie, and he hides in an oatmeal, which fits perfectly because oatmeal is his favorite meal for breakfast. So yeah. And I also remember the Elmo's World Camera segment as well, by the way. Now on to season 37. Now this one's actually a smaller list, because when this season came out, most of the episodes would come on in 2006, and unfortunately, this was when I started 3rd grade, where I moved to another elementary school, and they started school at 7:30 a.m. in the morning, so I wouldn't have time to watch Sesame Street at all, unfortunately. So yeah. But this is the list of the episodes I remember seeing. I would only be able to watch them on the weekends, so yeah. Starting off with 4109. This, I think, might have been the only episode I remember seeing with Abby Cadabby in the show. So yeah. And I do kind of remember the number of the day being 4, because I do remember seeing the grid of a scene where 4 kids dance in a color block grid, and the Elmo's World Friends segment. 4110, I put a question mark here because I might remember seeing the Abby Cadabby going to school, and I might remember the scene where Shirley Jones plays Mrs. Goose or Mother Goose, and maybe the letter day, which was C. So yeah, and the number of the day, for those that are wondering, was 2, I think. Yep. So yeah, now going on to 4111. The only thing I remember this episode is the Waiter Grover segment. This is like the only time I would see a Waiter Grover scene with Mr. Johnson, which he was annoyed by Grover's work performing, by Grover's jobs. And like this episode, in this segment, Grover works at a Russian restaurant, and he sings about foods that are out of stock. So yeah. And I might remember the Elmo's World telephone segment being used as well. 4116. What can I say about this one? Let's see. Let me hang on. I gotta get to it real quick. Hang on, I'm getting there. So 4116, I do remember seeing that episode because I might remember seeing Elmo and the scene where Elmo and Abby play school. I do believe I've seen this episode because I do remember the episode. Yes, I did see it actually, because I do remember the number of the day where the count counts a kid hopping 11 times named Kale. For those that are wondering. Yeah, yes, so I can officially say I did see this episode all along. 4117, I put a question mark here because I might remember the scene where Anthony talks with a broccoli about his favorite vegetable. And maybe the Global Grover segment, I don't know though. And maybe the number day was just 9. The letter day was J, for those that are wondering. 4122. Now, this episode I do remember seeing. I think it's because I remember the number of the day, but let me get to it. Once I get to it on my iPad, I'll let you know. I'll be there in just a moment. Just hang on a second, guys. Yeah, this list is pretty small because, like I said, I didn't have time to watch most of these because I had to get to school, unfortunately. But yeah, 4122. Yes, I do remember seeing this episode because I do remember. Yes, it was I thought so. Yeah, because I do remember the number of the day of this episode, which was 13. Because I do remember the Milo counting 13 segment. I honestly had a Mandela effect that Milo would count past the number 13, but he did not, unfortunately. So yeah, there was never an episode where he would do that. And the letter day in this episode, for those that are wondering, was A. Episode 4129. This one. What can I say about this one? Once I get to it, I'll let you know. Hang on, I got a couple more just to get to. Pass. Hang on, I'm almost there. Just 1 second, guys. Okay. I might remember the number of the day of this episode, which was 18, because I do remember seeing the segment where the count counts Catalina jumping rope 18 times. 4130, I might remember this episode because I might remember the scene where Gina announces she's adopting a baby and goes to Guatemala, which is actually where Rosita's from. No. Rosita was actually from Mexico. Sorry about that. Guatemala is next to Mexico. Sorry about that. And I also remember the Elmo's World segment, which was fast and slow, because I do remember, kind of, so yeah. And finally, episode 4031. I put a question mark in this one because I might remember the Big D and Little D segment in this one. The number of the day of this episode, it was 11. And I might remember the rubber stamp segment in this episode. So yeah. So yeah, this is all the episodes I remember seeing from this block. Thank you for watching and have a great day.